Over 400 years have passed since the period known as the Renaissance, yet some things haven't changed. We still often make portraits, and for the same reasons as our ancestors. We use images of ourselves to mark important moments in our lives, to celebrate friendships, to welcome recent arrivals to the family, and to remember those who are no longer with us. Pictures of people are also still central to the politics of propaganda, as imagery is used to promote and attack public figures. But we need to go back to the Renaissance if we are to find out how portraiture became such a central part of our lives. It was during the 15th and 16th centuries that this type of art developed with extraordinary variety and creativity. The portrait, a physiognomic likeness which is seen to refer to the identity of a particular person, has existed since antiquity. The Emperor Nero's portrait appears on this 1st century brass coin. The image tells us what the emperor looked like. Of course, now we can only say how accurate it is by comparing it with other portraits and descriptions of him. What is clear is that it stands in for a person who is not present, and in this case confers some of his power upon a monetary token. This portrait by Memling shows a Renaissance collector of antique coins, possibly the Venetian ambassador Bernardo Bembo. Histories of portraiture used to suggest that artists had forgotten how to make naturalistic portraits like this, after centuries when it was more common to use a symbol such as a coat of arms to represent someone. It was supposed that the rediscovery of antique examples, which happened at the same time as an increasing interest in the notion of the individual, fuelled an apparent boom in the production of portraits. We now know that the situation was much more complex than that.
I think there are two important strands in this period, and one of them is certainly the impact of classical antiquity, of looking at ancient sculpture, ancient coins, and the idea that people in the Renaissance wanted to emulate people from the ancient Greece and Rome. Some people think that portraits died after the collapse of ancient Rome, but actually that's not true. And of course there are lots of portraits on tombs, in altarpieces where people are portrayed as donors, as votive portraits, in manuscripts and so on. What was new was likeness. People wanted to be portrayed looking as they did so that they could be remembered as individuals. And that was important because people believed in those days, and some still do, in the concept of purgatory, that area where people's souls went after death before they could go to heaven. Looking at portraits helped people to remember individuals and helped them to remember that they needed to be prayed for, that they needed to be got out of purgatory and into heaven. And they were thinking very hard about their souls as well as their features, so both together are what's being portrayed in the portraits.
Realistic likenesses facilitated an active form of remembrance that was closely linked to the contemplation of paintings of religious figures, themselves believed to be authentic portraits. An inscription on the stone parapet beneath this portrait by Jan van Eyck from 1432 tells us that this is a léal souvenir, a faithful memory of the young man depicted. The wording below includes Van Eyck's signature and notes precisely the date that the portrait was made, emphasising the presence of the artist who bore solemn witness to this man's existence. Antiquity did provide useful models, particularly for portraits which communicated ideas about power and status. This portrait of a lady seems to be one of the earliest surviving independent examples. Her clothes suggest that she may have been a high-ranking member of the English or French courts. The artist who painted her in about 1400 has adopted the profile format used on ancient coins. It confers something of the status of a ruler upon the sitter. The Italian painter and sculptor Pisanello has used the same profile format for his portrait of Leonello d'Este. It was made in 1441, when Leonello became Marquis of Ferrara. His massive curls seems to have been slightly exaggerated, and his long nose given prominence. They emphasise characteristics that make a flattering play on his name, which means little lion. The suggestion is that Leonello is brave and will make a fine ruler over the city-state of Ferrara. Such courts were major cultural centres, and a range of different portraits were produced for their leaders. Pisanello was one of many artists who made portrait medals, which were kept in collectors' studies and handed round groups of connoisseurs to provoke discussion. The double-sided nature of the medal offered rich opportunities to communicate more than simply the subject's appearance. One of the range of ideas suggested by this blindfolded lynx was that the wise ruler sometimes has to turn a blind eye to what goes on around him. However, he, and therefore Leonello, is still ready to pounce if necessary. The profile format was highly valued by some. Leonardo da Vinci thought that it presented the most memorable view of the sitter. It has certainly captured the distinctive nose and fashionably high forehead of this Florentine lady, painted by Baldovinetti in about 1465. It also gives prominence to the design on her sleeve. Expensive dresses were given as betrothal gifts, and this one probably displays the emblem of the family into which this woman had married. However, the profile did not offer as much opportunity to show expression as other views of the face. This extraordinary painting of Johann Kleberger by Albrecht Dürer shows the subject appearing to break free from the confines of the antique profile. His head appears to project into the viewer's space. This three-dimensional illusion also suggests how influential sculpture was on Renaissance portraiture, whether painted or in stone. Antique busts clearly influenced this sculpture of the banker Francesco Sassetti, attributed to Antonio Rossellino. He even wears a Roman cloak to add authority to his penetrating gaze. Mino da Fiesole's apparently unidealised bust of the heavy-jawed Florentine Niccolo Strozzi is solid and cut off squarely below the shoulders. This recalls another sculptural precedent, the reliquary bust. Often realistically carved and painted, these religious sculptures had a special air of authenticity because they contained compartments that held small pieces of what was believed to be the body of a particular saint. This painted wooden bust of a young woman was made sometime between 1450 and 1475 by a Florentine artist in the circle of Desiderio da Settignano.
Up until 3 years ago, it was always believed that this was a bust of a young Florentine beauty because her hair is caught up in a hairstyle which was fashionable in the 15th century in Florence. But in 2005, the sculpture was cleaned, and on the waistband of her dress was revealed an inscription which in fact identifies her as St. Constance, who was a virgin martyr. And in fact, this explains her rather melancholic and yet steadfast expression much better, I think. Conservation also revealed two apertures, two openings in her skull, one at the top and one at the back. And certainly one of these could be opened and probably contained a relic. So what's extraordinary is that the artist has made a portrait of a saint, but obviously he would never have known what St. Constance actually looked like. So he has taken the likeness of a real, if idealised, woman and transformed her into St. Constance.
New technical innovations helped portraiture to become more realistic, particularly in the field of painting. Northern European artists made important advances and developed formats which increased the naturalistic illusion created by portraits. The Netherlandish painter Jan van Eyck perfected the use of oil rather than egg to bind his pigments together, making it possible for him to blend colours and create highly realistic effects. This picture could be a self-portrait from 1433. Van Eyck painted his wife Margaret in 1439, using his oil technique to show every detail of her skin and hair. However, naturalism did not mean simply painting what was in front of him. Van Eyck has enlarged the size of his wife's head and placed her distinctive nose more in profile than the rest of her face. Such distortions were common practice, seen as a way to increase both likeness and a sense of lively expression. They also demonstrate that such apparently realistic images were not traced from projections made using lenses and mirrors. No such device would produce this combination of distortions. They are deliberate manipulations devised by the painter.
It seems to me that the triumphant strand of portraiture is Netherlandish in this period. This sense that the sitter is really there, very, very present. In the 15th century, Netherlandish and Italian portraiture, especially at the beginning of the century, look rather dissimilar, rather unalike. But in the 16th century, it's actually the Netherlandish portraits, with their emphasis on presence, on likeness, this sense of somebody really being there, that becomes the key strand that dominates, in a sense, elaborated in different countries in different ways. But it's really, you can trace it right back to Van Eyck and then all the way through into the 16th century.
Artists and portraits were both transportable commodities, and innovations quickly spread. Netherlandish oil paintings became so prized in Italy that local artists soon sought to imitate the thin glazes and minute brushstrokes that created them. The Sicilian Antonello da Messina made this portrait, which mimics Netherlandish techniques, during a stay in Venice around 1475. By the turn of the century, the leading Venetian painter Giovanni Bellini had perfected his own use of oil. This portrait of Leonardo Loredan was made soon after the sitter had been elected Doge, leader of the Venetian Republic. Bellini achieved the shimmering effect of his damask mantle using short, thick brushstrokes laden with lead tin yellow and lead white paint, suggesting individual woven loops as they catch the light. He has made full use of the three-quarter face view, suggesting different qualities with each side of Loredan's face. He appears both stern and approachable. Bellini allows his features to express both ideas simultaneously. However, there were limits to what could be communicated simply by a face and clothing, no matter how realistic and expressive they were. Including symbolic objects or attributes allowed a portrait to say far more about its subject. Such accessories could make a statement about a sitter's identity. Hans Holbein painted this portrait of a lady with a squirrel and a starling on his first visit to England around 1526–8. Both animals were common pets, but here they seem to have an extra significance. This could be Anne Ashby, Lady Lovell. The Lovell family coat of arms has 3 squirrels in it, and their family home was at East Harling in Norfolk. Starling could easily be a pun on this place name. Objects could also suggest particular ideas about a sitter's character, their inner life. Martin van Heemskerk depicted this lady producing woolen thread on a decorative spinning wheel. This device adds more to the image than simply some interesting curving lines. Spinning was associated with wifely virtue in the Bible. The high waist and bulging midriff of this woman suggests that she was pregnant, fulfilling her duties particularly well by producing heirs. Some sitters went further, adopting the guise of a figure they esteemed and hoped to emulate as a way of presenting a more complex idea of who they really were. Lorenzo Lotto painted Brother Gregorio Bello of Vicenza as Saint Jerome, the patron saint of the monastic order to which Bello belonged. He strikes his breast just as the saint had done as a gesture of penitence. Likeness was not enough for this man. He also wanted us to understand the depth of his religious fervour. In this intriguing portrait of Rudolph II by Giuseppe Arcimboldo, painted in about 1590, the emperor is entirely created from significant objects, in this case fruit and vegetables. The painting was sent as a witty gift to Rudolph at his court in Prague, and was an allegory of his harmonious and fruitful rule. It did also manage to look like him. Other portraits show his broad cheeks, rather puffy eyes and prominent nose. The objects depicted in a portrait were sometimes prized in their own right, included to present the sitter as a cultured collector. Lotto painted the Venetian Andrea Odoni in 1527, surrounded by some of the ancient sculptures he displayed on the ground floor of his palace, along with some famous examples in the background that he didn't own. But the messages they communicate are more complex than the obvious idea that he is a connoisseur. He holds a figurine of Diana of Ephesus, a symbol of nature and also of idolatry. This shows that he understands he must not value these earthly riches too highly. Recent cleaning has revealed a tiny crucifix dangling from his left hand. This is the true focus of his devoted contemplation. Another crucifix is hidden in the corner of one of the most famous Renaissance portraits, Holbein's painting of Jean de Dinteville and Georges de Selve, known as the Ambassadors. Again, it is a subtle sign that these two successful young men know not to feel too proud of their expensive clothes and of the range of objects which show the viewer just how learned they both are. We are assured that they are always aware of death, which floats in front of them in the form of a distorted skull. When viewed from the side, it becomes instantly recognisable. The sheer vanity involved in commissioning such a magnificent portrait is balanced by this firm reminder that all of these beautiful things will crumble to dust. The only everlasting life is with God. This painting was made in 1533, a time of particular religious tension. Dinteville was a French ambassador sent to the English King Henry VIII's court, just as Henry was preparing to break from the Catholic Church. Several of the objects seem to suggest anxiety about the situation. For example, the lute has a broken string, a sign that harmony has temporarily been disrupted. Dinteville commissioned this portrait when his friend came to visit him, noting that de Selve's presence had greatly cheered him during a rather miserable time in his life. Friendship increasingly became the impetus for portrait commissions during the Renaissance. The German painter Gerlach Flicker produced this small portrait of himself and a friend, Henry Strangewish or Strangeways, when they were both in prison in the mid-1550s. We do not know what Flicker's crime was, but Strangeways was a Dorset gentleman turned pirate who targeted ships in the English Channel, going under the name of Red Rover. The format mimics a diptych, a religious painting formed from two panels, and places the men together as if they were man and wife or father and son. Painters were creative about repurposing and expanding existing artistic models according to the needs of particular situations. Andrea Navagero and Agostino Beazzano marked their shared interests and affections by asking another mutual friend, Raphael, to paint them just before Navagero left to take up a new post in Venice. The image recalls the ancient double-effigy tomb portraits they used to study together in the countryside around Rome. The two men have turned around towards the viewer as if interrupting their conversation to include the new arrival.
It's a really groundbreaking picture in that nobody much before Raphael had shown two friends in a single field and achieved a new sense of intimacy. Mainly they've been shown as diptychs in the past. One funny thing about this picture, in view of the fact that it is such a revolutionary image of friends, is that the two men actually fell out shortly after it was painted. However, it was kept by a third friend. It really was a keepsake portrait, and it was known to have been in Bembo's collection. So it's likely that it was made by a friend for a fourth friend, and whoever stands in front of it today is recreating the circle of friendship.
Contemporary sculptures, such as this piece by Tullio Lombardo, were also sometimes inspired by ancient Roman tomb portraits. Here, there are references to painting as well.
What's so interesting in this piece is the incised framing line around the outside of the figures' heads. In fact, the sculpture was originally partly polychromed, it was partly painted, so there would have been a nice play between a three-dimensional sculpture and what might have appeared like a two-dimensional painting. Perhaps Tullio was saying something about the primacy of sculpture over painting. When I saw this sculpture, what absolutely amazed me was the carving of the couple's hair. The young man has got tight ringlets, which the sculptor has chiselled deep to give a sense of tight curls that are bouncing up. And she has thicker, longer, wavier hair, which is caught up under a hairnet. The hairnet itself was probably made of lace, and you can see that it's delicately patterned with flowers and leaves. It's interesting, in fact, that she wears a hairnet, because to wear your hair up in the Renaissance was a sign that you were married. So it may be that this sculpture was commissioned to commemorate the marriage of a young couple. Having said this, both their features are very idealised, and so it has been suggested, because the young man has a wreath of vine leaves in his hair, that this is a representation of Bacchus and Ariadne. I think probably the answer is that it falls somewhere between portraiture and straightforward idealisation, and that we will never know their true identification.
Portraiture was, of course, a crucial part of the social business of love and marriage across Europe. A portrait could suggest availability. This painting by Albrecht Dürer may show Katharina Fürleger at the age of 18. Her hair is coiled around her head in a large plait, showing that she has reached marriageable age. She holds sea holly, which symbolises fortune, and 2 stalks of southernwood, which was used in love potions. Perhaps she was hoping to be betrothed soon. Painted likenesses played a vital part in the negotiation of high-level marriages. Henry VIII sent Holbein to Brussels in March 1538 to make this full-length portrait of Christina of Denmark, a young widow he was considering as his 4th wife. The king would have expected that she be shown full face, so that no imperfections could be hidden. He was pleased with the portrait and kept it, even though, perhaps mercifully for Christina, the negotiations eventually came to nothing. This miniature by the English painter Nicholas Hilliard from about 1588 may refer to the pleasures and pains of love. A young man stands surrounded by roses, which smell sweet but are also covered with thorns. He places a hand on his heart as he gazes out rather mournfully. He may have been spurned. It was also, though, fashionable for Elizabethan lovers to appear melancholy, tormented by their intense love. Many courtships were, of course, successfully concluded in marriage, and unions between couples from wealthy families were often commemorated with portraiture. Lorenzo Lotto painted Marsilio Cassotti and his new wife Faustina in 1523. Lotto has made their union explicit, showing the moment that Marsilio places the wedding ring onto the 3rd finger of Faustina's hand. It was believed that a vein led from that finger straight to the heart. Cupid joins the couple together with a wooden yoke that represents their marital responsibilities, which was seen as an opportunity for exemplary behaviour. A laurel branch grows from the yoke, a sign of fidelity and symbol of virtue. It is no longer thought that this portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini depicts the actual moment of his marriage. However, he has certainly chosen to be shown in a gesture of union with his wife, in clothing and an interior that signalled their wealth. Oranges were rare and expensive in Bruges in 1434, when Jan van Eyck made this painting. Here they are strewn casually on a windowsill. Even though there are cherries on the trees outside, the couple wear heavy furs and mitres of the finest wool. Arnolfini's wife has so much fabric in her dress that she gathers it up in front of her. It looks to our eyes as if she is pregnant, but other images from the period show virgin saints in similar luxurious dresses. Making portraits of family was a central preoccupation across Europe during the Renaissance for all sorts of reasons. Piero di Cosimo painted Giuliano da San Gallo and his father Francesco Giamberti in about 1485. Piero repainted the striped cloth in the foreground of the first panel so that both paintings appear to share the same perspective when they are placed about 2.5 centimetres apart. The landscape behind the sitters flows from one panel to the other, providing a further connection. Giuliano suggests that he is part of an intellectual lineage by showing both himself and his father with objects that refer to their professions of architect and musician, by now firmly established among the liberal arts. Hans Ewerth helped Mary Neville, Lady Dacre, to publicly remember her dead husband, Thomas Fiennes, in the late 1550s. He had been hanged a decade earlier as a common criminal for the death of a servant during a poaching expedition, and his lands and title had been taken away. He appears in a portrait behind Lady Mary, who shows by the rosemary and forget-me-nots at her breast that her husband is still in her thoughts. This formidable woman is busy writing, perhaps some kind of religious statement. Eventually, her faith and persistent petitioning paid off, and the family fortunes were restored. Mary Neville was acting in the interests of her son, Gregory. Children were, of course, a major factor in the production of family imagery. Portraits of sons in particular were a way of showing that the family line was being continued. In 1477, Justus of Ghent painted the 5-year-old Guidobaldo with his father, Federico da Montefeltro. He was Duke of Urbino, a powerful figure who used art throughout his palace to present ideas about his rule. This panel was originally displayed there, presenting Guidobaldo as the son and heir who literally learns at his father's knee. Federico is shown as a ruler, a military man and a scholar, as well as a father who sets a fine example to the boy who would one day succeed him. As portraiture formats became more varied, children were often paired with the parent of the same gender, receiving specific instruction and guidance. This portrait probably shows Giovanni della Volta and his family, with whom Lorenzo Lotto lodged in the mid-16th century. Cherries, the fruits of paradise, provide the starting point for gendered games. The girl plays with their fruitful abundance in her mother's hand, suggesting fertility, while the boy is taught a lesson in self-restraint by his father, who holds more cherries just out of reach. The boy's near nakedness allows us to see his genitals, so that the viewer understands that the family line will continue. Both parents curve protectively around their children. The safety and comfort of the family base contrasts with the landscape visible through the window. Sometimes children were portrayed independently. Relatives far away often asked for images which showed how they were progressing. More fragile works, such as this wonderful painted and gilded terracotta bust attributed to Guido Mazzoni, were kept at home. This seems to be a particularly animated portrait of a child. The fact that it has been a documented part of English royal collections for centuries suggests that it might show a prince, possibly the young Henry VIII. His wide smile is unusual in portraiture from this period. The artist may have been trying to represent not just his features, but also a more universal concept of youthful glee, or the way that a child's attention can quickly be captured by something new and exciting. The line between real and ideal was often blurred, particularly in societies which celebrated physical and moral beauty and related them to each other. Palma Vecchio's paintings of lovely women could be portraits. This one from around 1520 leans her arm on a ledge, a common portrait pose by this point. The artist may have been demonstrating the beauty of the sitter's soul by showing the perfection of her body. However, some experts believe that the numerous paintings like this produced during the period were actually more about an ideal than any individual sitter, and that there was a lively market for such images. Surrounding yourself with beauty was believed to have a positive impact on many aspects of life, even helping couples to conceive healthy, handsome children. Men as well as women could be represented in terms of ideal beauty and virtuous character. Debates about the possible identity of this man by Palma Vecchio have concluded that if this does represent a particular sitter, then he was one primarily concerned with how close he came to an ideal of male spirituality and creativity. He is the epitome of the dreamy young poet. This portrait of a young man by Pontormo also seems to blend real and ideal.
We're really delighted to be able to include this picture in the exhibition because it hasn't been seen since the early 19th century. There's every chance that this is a portrait mentioned by Vasari in his life of Pontormo, of a young man called Carlo Neroni. He's wearing black, which is nero in Italian, and so this could be a possible pun on his name. His age exactly fits what we know from his biography with the age of the sitter in the portrait. He was only 18, and Vasari says that the picture was painted during the time of the siege of Florence.
Neroni's natural good looks have been emphasised by Pontormo. He has nipped in the sitter's waist to give him an elegant body shape. The artist has also suggested that he has an ideal character too. With one beautiful hand, Neroni slips what seems to be a love letter into his jacket. The other hand has a ring which suggests that he is betrothed or married. This hand is also poised to take out his sword if needed.
I think you could say that he's been portrayed as the ultimate nobleman, in that he's balancing affairs of the heart with defence of the realm, if you like. I've often thought about the lines from Lovelace's poem in connection with this picture of "I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honour more."
Just as sometimes we're now unsure whether a painting is a portrait or a more general ideal, so we cannot always be certain of the extent to which others were intended as caricature. Quentin Massais painted these two panels in about 1513. Connected by the same ledge, they appear to be portraits, reunited here for the first time in centuries. The woman's facial deformities are thought now to have been the result of Paget's disease. However, there is an undeniable element of satire in this image too. She offers a rosebud to her companion even though her own bloom evidently wilted some years ago. Her exposed breasts and the devilish horns of her headdress suggest that she is being lampooned as a personification of lust. Renaissance theories of physiognomy placed great emphasis on the connection between external appearance and internal character. It is perhaps a testament to this elderly man's fine nature that the young boy, presumably his grandson, is not at all repulsed by the growths on his nose. He gazes up adoringly, a clear-eyed child who unquestioningly places his trust and affection in this man. A drawing by the artist Ghirlandaio gives a valuable insight into the way that this portrait was made. Like the painting, the drawing dates to about 1490 and seems to have been studied either from the man's corpse or his death mask. This was a wax or plaster cast taken from the dead body as a memento. Ghirlandaio has then brought this face back to life in the final painted version, stylising the growths on the man's nose to minimise their impact and turning the corners of the mouth up so that he smiles at the boy. He has angled the man's face downwards so that there have not had to be too many changes to the eyes. The opposite process seems to have taken place in this portrait of Leonardo Buonafede by Francesco da San Gallo. He made a preparatory drawing for his carved marble effigy of Buonafede, who was the elderly prior of a monastery at Galluzzo, outside Florence.
When I started working on this drawing, it was said to have been made post-mortem. However, I looked at it very carefully and noticed that the flesh sags downwards towards the chin rather than to the ear, and that the back of the head is represented, which would not be normally shown if working from a death mask or a corpse. And I realised that indeed the sitter must have been upright and therefore alive. When I went back to the documents, I discovered that the sculptor who made this drawing had finished his tomb a couple of years before Buonafede died in his 90s, and therefore we see the sitter not dead but feigning death.
Drawing was an important part of the process of portrait manufacture. Different artists approached their craft in a wide variety of ways, and portraits could be made from existing images without any need for a sitting. However, many artists did meet their subjects and would take careful note of their appearance in the sometimes limited time available to them. Sittings could be boring, and artists offered each other advice on how to keep the subject happy. Nicholas Hilliard advised discreet talk or reading, quiet mirth or music, as these offend not, shorten the time and quicken the spirit, both in the drawer and in him which is drawn.
Maroni.
Yes.
Yeah.
It would be good.
Yeah.
It's quite good.
Hans Holbein was particularly skilled at producing elegant, informative drawings during sittings that might only last for a few hours in total. He sketched Grace Newport, Lady Parker, in the early 1540s for a painting that was either never completed or has since been lost. Her face is disproportionately large, but this allows us to see all of her delicate features. Holbein would often make detailed written notes to accompany his drawings to aid his memory back in the studio. Limited technological help was available to those who lacked Holbein's superior talents. Dürer recommended this contraption to artists who felt unsure of their abilities. You looked through a peephole and traced the outlines of the sitter with sticky paint onto a pane of glass, then pressed paper to the glass to remove the image. Most successful portrait artists, however, developed excellent drawing skills through necessity and practice. They used themselves as subject matter, as Pontormo has done here in this dynamic self-portrait from the early 1520s. He has deliberately set himself the difficult task of showing his arm extending towards the viewer at eye level. Albrecht Dürer made many self-portraits for all sorts of reasons. The German inscription at the top of this small drawing translates as, "Where the yellow spot is and where the finger points is where it hurts me." Was this sent to a doctor to help with the diagnosis of a medical problem? At the same time, Dürer has shown himself very much like images of Christ, with the lance wound made in his side. He could have been invoking Christ's healing powers or making another more complex analogy. Although it is often difficult to be sure of the original status of particular drawings, it seems that some highly finished pieces were intended as works of art in their own right. This portrait of a bearded man by an unknown North Italian artist from around 1500 appears to fall into this category. It is far more detailed than a preparatory study would ever have needed to be. This painting of a smiling boy holding a simple drawing could be a playful parody of the portrait artist and his drawing skills. At the same time, it shows off the artist Carotto's talent. Creating a convincing depiction of laughter was considered to be a very difficult challenge. This painting sets up a number of ideas for us to contemplate, not least the way in which the smiling boy seems so proud of a drawing that we can see looks nothing like him. Is Carotto suggesting that portraiture rarely shows us as we really are? This portrait's informality may be explained by the fact that this boy could well be Carotto's son. He has red hair, just as his father did. Carota means carrot in Italian. At the same time that such apparently spontaneous formats developed, there were also important advances within the far more formal worlds of papal and court portraiture. Leaders were among those who thought most carefully about their self-image and had the power and resources to command the best artists of their day. In order to glorify Rome, and no doubt himself too, Pope Julius II transformed the Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica, commissioning new buildings and decorative schemes including Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. He asked Raphael to make this portrait of him in 1511 and was no doubt closely involved in its design. Although frail from a recent illness and wearing a beard as a sign of penance following a military defeat, we are left in no doubt that this is still a man of energy and conviction. His eyes appear tired, but his mouth is set in a line of grim determination. He projects a powerful image, the pyramid of his robed body wedged into his chair, one hand gripping its arm with extraordinary vigour. It's clear from contemporary records that this portrait had a huge impact when it went on show.
The portrait was bequeathed by the Pope to the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, and after he died, it was hung on the altar for 8 days. The people of Rome apparently flocked to see it, and Vasari later reported that it was so lifelike and true that it struck fear into those who saw it.
This image of Julius would be a highly influential portrait. The angled chair placed at the front of the picture suggests both powerful presence and creates a sense of intimacy. This innovative device became a standard feature in papal portraiture. The Venetian artist Titian used it for this portrait of Pope Paul III, made perhaps for his grandson, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese.
It seems that the Farnese family wanted Titian to be a kind of familiar, somebody who was actually part of their inner circle, and painting them in that way, so that this portrait combines the formal and the informal. It shows Paul III as if dressed for a papal audience, but it lacks the key ingredient of the little cap that he wore when he was seen in public. So probably this was made for a member of the family, perhaps for Cardinal Alessandro, who kept it later, we know, in his guardaroba, a notionally private space.
The family context for this portrait may explain why the Pope looks rather stooped, his robes a little crumpled. The chair is still a crucial part of the composition. It provides the perfect counterbalance to Paul's body, containing and therefore emphasising his energy, which is undiminished by age. The Netherlandish painter Antonis Moore adapted the papal pose for this portrait of Mary Tudor, made in 1554, soon after her marriage to Philip II of Spain. Like most European princes, Philip used portraiture in the arrangement of his marriages. He had apparently been disappointed when he saw his second wife Mary in the flesh and cursed the painters and envoys who had presented an overly flattering picture of her. Moore was commissioned to make a realistic portrait of Mary. He has shown her as a rather plain, tense but determined figure, literally on the edge of her seat. Mary's new husband was deeply concerned with his own image, continuing his father Charles V's interest in portraying Habsburg dynastic ambitions. The Spanish court became the site of significant innovations in state portraiture. Series of sculptures were planned to represent the royal line, often drawing upon ancient imperial imagery, as in this bust of Charles V by a Netherlandish sculptor after a model by Leone Leoni. The Italian also made this bronze of Philip II for his aunt, Mary of Hungary, for a planned gallery of Habsburg rulers which was never completed. Philip appears as an idealised Roman leader, his armour decorated with both religious imagery and mythological figures, including Hercules. He is a strong, youthful demigod. Philip II employed Titian to create flattering, large-scale portraits of him as a dignified young royal. These adapted full-length portrait formats for rulers that had been established by Northern European artists. The increasing use of canvas as a support for paintings made the creation of large but still transportable works much more feasible. Once it has dried, a canvas painted with oils can simply be rolled up and reattached to a new timber frame or stretcher when it reaches its final destination. Titian made this portrait of Philip in 1551, emphasising his elevated rank through the column, velvet-covered table and his fine armour from Augsburg. He also flattered Philip, slimming him down and making him taller. The king was pleased, but increasingly found fault with the sketchy quality of some of Titian's later work, writing that if there had been time, he would have asked the artist to go over it again. Antonis More developed Titian's models for state portraiture, adding a more precise finish. Here, he has cleverly rearranged Philip's body and baton into a series of triangles, which makes him seem more substantial. He has also deliberately repositioned the king's ear so that the diagonal line of the jaw is continued, creating another strong shape. More used the full-length court portrait format for this depiction of the entertainer Perejón. He was employed to amuse the Count of Benavente and was a great favourite of Philip II's. Does this use of the noble pose satirise the jester, with his evidently deformed hand and wrinkled stockings? Is he in some senses a foil for the princely perfection on display in royal portraits? His face, however, is portrayed with dignity. Close to the king himself, More cannot have been unaware of Philip's affection for Perejón. Perhaps this portrait is a sincere, objective representation of a fellow courtier who is just as worthy of serious consideration as the artist himself. By the end of the Renaissance, portraiture had been established as a thriving art form all over Europe, and an extraordinary range of formats had been developed. These were also now available for anyone who wanted their image made. Even a tailor could commission his own likeness. Portraiture was no longer simply the preserve of the most wealthy and powerful. The success of portraiture during the Renaissance was not only due to the opportunities it gave all sorts of people to remember their friends and family, or to present themselves to their peers in particular ways. The Italian painting theorist Alberti wrote in 1435 that painting contains a divine force which not only makes the absent present, as friendship is said to do, but moreover makes the dead seem almost alive. There is something magical about looking into the eyes of a sitter who died several hundred years ago and feeling a connection to that person. Of course, it's an illusion, but we believe it to be real because portraits are so effective at standing in for the individual. For viewers today, perhaps this is the true power of the Renaissance portrait.